Andrew has, over, 40 years now? Yeah. Been evolving his own brand, if you like, or his own perspective on what can be done with post-Jungian orientation. And he's made a particular point of trying to integrate that with relational and humanistic approaches beyond the usual psychotherapeutic remit. So it's involved social and political dimensions. He's a founder board member of the International Association for Relational Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy, past chair of the UK Council for Psychotherapy, and co-founder of the Psychotherapists and Counsellors for Social Responsibility. Now he's a professor at Essex and holds visiting chairs at New York and London. And his long list of publications will be found in the bookshop. So what I also know about Andrew is that he particularly relishes, if I can say that, the live exchange. And although his presentation this morning is going to be structured to some extent, there'll be spaces to explore what's there to be explored this morning. And I think also he's at his best in the to and fro of the questions and answers at the end. So I'll quickly retire from the stage and leave Andrew to it so we can get to that.
This morning I'm reading a paper. I'm going to read from a prepared text, which is very unusual for me, as some of you know. I prefer to speak from notes or even without notes. But if the system of providing written translations is going to work, and I think it's a very important development to provide written translations, then obviously what the speaker says should resemble, to a very considerable extent, what the translation says. Otherwise, it's just cosmetic. And the Anglophone domination will simply continue. Who was clapping? Verena. Yeah, Verena, no, it's important. It's an important problem. Here's the introduction. No talk or paper exists in a vacuum. The fact that this conference is happening in Berlin is decisive for me. This is the first time I have returned here since Fred Plaut died in 2009, aged 96. He was, as most of you will know, a training analyst of both the British and the German societies, and a former editor of the Journal of Analytical Psychology, elected, as he often recalled, in a bitterly contested election. My relationship with Fred took up most of my adult life, and I dedicate this talk to his memory. Despite the 36-year age gap, we often joked that we fathered each other. Fred wrote in his autobiography that I was his best friend. And I wrote in the margin, when I was editing the book, the one word, ditto. I don't know, this sign? The same. On the subject of friendship, how sad am I that Tom Kirsch is not here, because many of the themes that I'm going to be entertaining today are things I've talked about with Tom over many years. Anyway, in his autobiographical book, I think an underappreciated book, Fred wrote that if the evolution of analytical theory and practice over more than a century demonstrates anything, it is that the theory and practice of analysis not only changes in time, but also that it is at no time the same for everybody and everywhere. Fred's aperçu is one reason why I suggested to the IAAP that the title of the next Congress in Kyoto in 2016 should be One Analytical Psychology or Many. They didn't go with that title. Something about anima mundi. You know, something that opens our world up to everybody. to talk about the anima mundi. Sorry for the sarcasm, but there it is. What I had in mind with one analytical psychology, or many, was that we would talk about the meaning for our profession of the migration of Jungian analysis from its European heartlands, including the forced migration from here in Germany to which we were exposed yesterday. Are we still refugees? Or, as we expand the boundaries of the Jungian world, south and east, are we IAAP missionaries, Western imperialists, shadowy salesmen and saleswomen? Or, conversely, are we the praiseworthy conveyors of things that are good beyond dispute, rather like vaccines? Here is how I'm planning to proceed following this brief introduction. The first section concerns the personal context in which the talk is being given. It's really a series of personal confessions. Then in the second section, I will discuss critically how and why we use the concepts of transference and countertransference in analysis, but still in that second section, I go on to take an equally critical look at the possibilities of a more relational approach to the analytical process. So I'm critical in both directions, critical of the transference stuff and critical of the relational stuff, and hence clearly self-critical. The third section looks at some aspects of the relationship between analytical psychology and politics and goes on to consider the massive problematic of diversity and equality in our profession. In this section, I have in mind the IAAP conference that will take place in London in December, entitled Analysis and Activism, Social and Political Contributions of Jungian Psychology. You have the flyer for that conference in your packs here. As the talk proceeds, I will be asking you, the audience, to join in two carefully constructed experiential exercises in conversation with your neighbors. You don't have to enjoy it, you just have to do it. I hope you will not mind in participating with the attempt to bring a more experiential, workshop-like feel to my presentation. Okay, this is the first section, my personal confessions. Jung, as you know, famously wrote that every psychology is a personal confession, and that remark guides me here. The editors of the journal specifically invited me to be personal, and so I'd like to show why, to the best of my conscious knowledge, some of the themes in my work came to be there from a personal angle. I have not spoken about this in public before. In 1967, at the age of 18, I was a highly political young man, but trying to realize my political dreams through the arts, specifically theater. We were a successful, radical, agit-prop theater company. Do you remember them? Actually, when I look at any Jungian audience, I know that you will remember. The lack of young people is a real issue for us. We were a successful company, and then I became a youth counselor using theater to work with alienated young people. After an encounter with humanistic psychology, which was a serious career option for a while, I went into Jungian analysis and, I think I must say, therefore, dropped out of the political world for a decade. So when Thatcherism came in the 1980s, there was I, former Trotskyist, student radical, no longer into agitprop, but busy writing Jungian books. Shame. Anyway, gradually the political side of my personality and my interest in society came back in and merged with my clinical concerns, leading to the formation of my brainchild, Psychotherapists and Counselors for Social Responsibility in the UK. At its peak, I should add, this organization, known in Britain as PCSR, had over 900 members, which was fantastic. Then, unfortunately, the psychoanalytic element of the membership decided, because it's Britain with the class system, they didn't want to be with so many Jungians and humanistic therapists that they all disappeared. Now, PCSR has about 250 members, still active though. Anyway, when I began to have real children, as often seems to happen with men, a third strand in which we called spiritual. Psychotherapy, politics, and spirituality, three sides of a coin. Charles Péguy, the French writer on religious matters, said that everything starts in mysticism and ends in politics, and the reverse is true as well. This account is up to now somewhat external and avoids my beginnings in my family. I've always struggled to find a vigorous to and fro movement in my image of my parents' marriage. I'm not saying it was never there, only that I had an image of a static, conventional togetherness without much passion or risk-taking. They were kind to each other, but never went near, in my fantasy anyway, the grotesque and divine experimentations I found a need to write about in my paper on the image of the parents in bed. I'll talk about my mother in a moment. My father was a gentleman, and I mean this in two senses. First, that he was a well-educated man, Cambridge. He'd been through the war, ending up in both Italian and German prisoner of war camps. Our summer holidays, bizarrely, this is an addition to the text, our summer holidays involved visiting those places in the Mediterranean, notably Sicily, that he had bombed. So we would find a resort close to Catania, for example, which he bombed quite a lot. He enjoyed a cultivated and comfortable lifestyle, ranging from golf to classical music. But he was also, for me, what I came to call in my writings, say in 2001, a dry father, not using his body to give out much erotic or aggressive playback, but a decent and polite man. In fact, I felt he depended on me to provide a kind of excitement, and via my rebellious, bad, and rejecting behavior, that is what I did. His father, by the way, was a self-made immigrant tycoon type, though the family business went bankrupt in the end. My concern, even obsession, with relations between women and men stems, I believe, from this respectable but emotionally constrained background. Hence, I've always found it hard to buy into Jungian essentialist approaches to gender because they felt and feel so limiting. That was why I wrote Beyond the Feminine Principle in 1989. And I have been strongly influenced by feminism in what I wrote over the years about women and men. For example, I've been influenced by Rosika Parker, Susie Orbach, and Jessica Benjamin, to name but three. As some here will know, I am a competitive person who delights in negotiation and bargaining. Competition, negotiation, bargaining. But over time, I have become able to agree with Gerhard Adler that there is a principle of complementarity at work in life. Some people are just better than others at some things. But when it comes to other things, other people are more adept. These principles, stemming, I believe, from my personal psychology, also lie at the heart of my take on pluralism, my take on one analytical psychology, or many, if you like: competition, negotiation, bargaining, and complementarity. Pluralism gave me an opportunity to be aggressive and competitive and tolerant and negotiatory at the same time. Although my classification in 1985 of the schools of post-Jungian analytical psychology was done before I developed pluralism as a theory in '89, it was the post-Jungian thing that made me into a pluralist. In the 70s and 80s, as so many of you will know, the Jungian analytical field was even less cohesive and comprehensible than it is today. I mean in terms of any beginner being able to find their way around in it. there were huge differences in approach, and things only held because each segment of the field claimed to derive something from the connection to Jung. I experienced it all a little differently from most of my friends and fellow students at that time in the 70s and 80s. I really liked the fragmented, argumentative nature of the field. I liked it, with its dispute, polemic, and lack of clarity. Because you see, to ad lib, the authority figures didn't know what they were doing. They were arguing and fighting with one another all the time. That meant that it was, in a way, paradoxically, very safe to be rebellious, because there was no single authority to shut you up. Anyway, for a novice analyst, to write an overview of the field into which he had just arrived was, of course, a huge inflation. But I certainly made a name for myself by doing it, which leads me to comment now on my mother's influence on me. She was very ambitious for me. It was she who spotted, with her down-to-earth intuition and generally savvy approach to life — savvy means wise as in streetwise — it was she who spotted that writing could be a way for me to make my mark. She wanted me to write. She went on and on about this, and unusually and amazingly, I listened to her. Even though I knew and know that my success was for her glory. Heracles, glory of Hera. This brings me to the not inconsiderable matter of my relationship on all levels to tricksters in general and to Hermes in particular. I do not know why I was the first to spot the potential of the idea of the female trickster. But I deplore that there is these days so much idealistic, sentimental, and romantic writing on the trickster, as if it was only a creative and constructive force, especially the female version. Be that as it may, Hermes still speaks to me. But the story of Hermes or of Andrew really remains resistant to a positive reading, to a wholly positive reading, because the shadow of being the messenger of the gods, or linking things up, is that the messenger becomes, or tries to become, more important than the message. So I am on a power trip. Yet I don't think it was only the need for power that motivated my controversial work on Jung and antisemitism from the mid-1980s until the publication of The Political Psyche in 1993. This material on Jung and antisemitism and other later discoveries was all originally published in the Journal of Analytical Psychology, but I have to say, after a hell of a struggle with one of the editors and also with Michael Fordham. The story is so horrible that I won't say it. The personal background to this project of working on Jung and antisemitism is very simple. It is the plain fact of being a Jewish man in a community whose founder had written objectionable things about my people. Fred and I discussed this all the time. All the time. In addition, of course, there was some kind of background wish present to do work that would make me more accepted as a contributor to academic, psychoanalytic, and political discourses, which was undermined by being seen as an adherent of that notorious anti-Semite Jung. The reactions of many Jungians to my early essays into the allegation of Jung's anti-Semitism really pissed me off, though on a good day, I could also empathize with them. It did feel a bit like being back in my family, in which I was always the black sheep. By the way, the unconscious, impregnated racism of this term is fantastic. I don't know if is it in German the same expression. Yes? Okay. So anyway, it felt, being in the Jungian community when I was writing about Jung and anti-Semitism, felt like being back in my family, in which I was always the black sheep, in Hebrew, the Rosha, the wicked son who opts out of the Passover Seder ceremony. In the early stages of our community's engagement with our problem, it's not Jung's problem, it's our problem, there was a closing of the Jungian ranks, a repetitious argument that Jung was merely a man of his time, and even some pathologizing of me and other critics as Jews with complexes. Well, Jung was, sorry to say, not, in fact, merely a man of his time, as you can see from the detailed research that I and others did. And it is those kinds of knee-jerk defenses that even today sometimes represent our problem, the Jungians' problem, and not Jung's problem. The knee-jerk, automatic defenses of Jung have become the problem, except in one community. Here in Germany, the engagement with this whole matter has been deeper and more honest than anywhere else in the world, and I want to pay a tribute to the help I had in my research from a number of German friends and colleagues. Gottfried Hoyer, Matthias von der Tann, who was, I think, here on Friday, Anna Springer, Regine Lockhart, what? Arvid, bless his memory. Yes, Arvid Erlenmeyer. These people did translations, did footwork going into archives and so on. This is the one community in the Jungian world who really can be proud, ironically perhaps, of what, it's obvious what's happened. No special prizes for any interpretations, but it needs to be stated. It's the one group of Jungians that have really addressed this matter deeply. Saw it yesterday. Even when they argue with each other, it's fine to argue. Anyway, to get back to my narrative, gradually the Jungian community worldwide realized that apology and reparation was needed, actually, and the informal alliance of concerned people that emerged, especially around the Congress in 1989, has done a pretty good job in this regard of apologizing, I mean. Some are here today, and of course, for those who need us as a tribal enemy to stay united, I mean the psychoanalysts mostly, this unfortunate legacy, despite our apologies and our reparations, provides a marvelous base for their silly games. Okay, well, we have done a good job on Jung and anti-Semitism and Jung in the 1930s. However, we shouldn't get too complacent because much explicatory and reparative work still needs to be done on Jung's racial attitudes, and especially his theories and utterances about Africans. And I will return to this in my third section on diversity and equality. So that's really the end of the personal confessions side of it. And I feel better than I thought I would, having spoken about it, which is an unusual experience for me. Up here, I usually become quite panic-stricken and depressed when I'm being nervous ahead, but this felt okay to me, which is a bit worrying, actually. Now it's time for the moment you have all been waiting for, which is the first experiential exercise. You should do this in little groups of 2 or 3 or 4. It's okay to stand up. It's okay to turn around. I mean, excuse me, sorry. To ask Jungian analysts to turn around might be a bit much, but you can turn around so you don't have to talk to the person you came in with. You don't have to talk to your husband or your wife. Try to talk to somebody maybe you don't know very well. Here's the job. I just want you to discuss with one another the kind of things I've been discussing, to the best of your conscious knowledge. How has the personality of your mother or your father or both, or if they were missing? How has all that impacted on your psychological ideas, including on your attitudes to clinical work and your values as a therapist or an analyst? I'm not saying, why did you become? I'm not saying discuss. Wait! Shh, shh, schweig. I don't want you to discuss why you became an analyst, okay? Because this you probably have done it. I want you to discuss how your mother's personality and your relationship with her actually affects what you think and what you do as an analyst, and your father's relationship and their relationship with each other. And if you want to bring brothers and sisters, it's absolutely fine. But, you know, how long? Three and a half minutes. But, you know, if you do this sort of thing, I'm telling you I'm going to give you the tricks of doing workshop stuff. If you tell people 3.5 minutes, of course, they can have 4.5 minutes. Do you understand what you're being asked to do? Not do you like it? Do you understand it? Okay, 1, 2, 3, go. It's enough, huh? Yeah. Okay. Okay. It's always very, very interesting as you walk around, getting the comments that people make. We already had "How long, O Lord, how long?" which I experienced as very funny and very aggressive. And then somebody said, "I need 3.5 years to do this." And someone else said, "We finished." I'm going to continue, and if you want to bring in anything that came up, there will be time at the end, but it's always a high-risk strategy doing these exercises in the middle of a lecture or talk, because you don't know about your timing. Anyway. The next, that is the second section of the talk, is entitled Clinical Work, a via negativa, problems with transference, countertransference, and also with the relational approach. In this part of the talk, I want to say a few things about transference and countertransference that are of a critical nature. Later, I will discuss relational approaches to the analytical process in equally critical vein. Whilst no one is going to be so naive as to say that these are alternatives to each other, transference, relational, or that they are mutually exclusive, or that you have to choose, all analysts here and therapists will appreciate, broadly speaking, why I might want to discuss transference, countertransference, and relational approaches separately. In our journal, Journal of Analytical Psychology, the previous editor, Warren Coleman, and one of the current editors, William Meredith Owen, have done a good job in opening up debate, transference, countertransference, relational. I think it's a tribute to the containing community of the JAP that two editors can debate with one another in a really frank and open way. And I'm here today to tell them that they are both wrong. I'm only joking. I apologize for following a via negativa in which neither transference, countertransference, nor relational approaches emerge unscathed. I hope it is not too depressing. But what we mean when we refer to being critical in any field, critical sociology, critical theology, critical psychology, critical analysis, what we mean when we use this word critical often brings us down. It's like there's no way out, and perhaps there isn't a way out. Because although I said they were both wrong, I didn't say I was right. Now, here are some specific critiques of the clinical usage of the ideas of transference and countertransference. Some of you will be familiar with some of them. Firstly, there are social critiques of the idea of transference and countertransference. These rest on the notion that therapy and analysis involve an induced relationship, an artificial relationship, not a natural one. The analytical relationship is imbued with the history, power dynamics, and authority structures of analysis itself. The relationship is an unequal one in an unhelpful way. And please note, very important to me, that this is the first of a number of references to inequality running through the talk like a red thread. So many transference phenomena are therefore very largely the result of suggestion. They're artificial. And they have less to do with the psychic reality of the patient, or as I prefer, client, than we sometimes think. These are social critiques. Then there are systemic critiques of transference, countertransference. Focus on transference, countertransference misses out the presence and impact of the wider human and non-human systems in which client, patient, and analyst are embedded. Families, friends, other people at work, society, the planet, and so on. Just to give a very simple example of something I found myself doing since thinking about systemic critiques of transference, countertransference, it's been really fascinating and illuminating to listen to what new clients say in the first interview when they're just a potential new client. They haven't committed to therapy, and I haven't committed to therapy. It's very interesting what they say when you ask them, what does your partner or your friends or your family or your workmates think about you having therapy? It's really interesting. The range of responses is fantastic. So we've done social critiques and systemic critiques. Now, reality critiques. This you all know about. This is a critique of those, mainly but not only in Freudian-based psychoanalysis, who see hints and references to the analyst in the discourse of the patient. Sometimes, as Nina Coulthard, sometimes these types of interpretations are called you mean me interpretations. So the inefficient car mechanic who fucked up the repair of your car, he's the useless therapist in disguised symbolic form. That's a you mean me interpretation. Or there's another variant of this, which are symbolic interpretations. So Mrs. Thatcher is your mother, David Cameron or Saddam Hussein or Osama bin Laden, they are your shadow. But sometimes the car mechanic or the boss at work or Saddam Hussein or Mrs. Thatcher or David Cameron, they just play themselves. Fourthly, ecological and political critiques. This is quite important, actually, these days. Stress on the transference-countertransference relationship makes it even more difficult for the client to express the impact on herself of planetary and environmental crisis or any other collective field of emotional distress. In principle, any political theme can be taken under the umbrella of the therapy relationship, and it is an important development in our field that people are doing that to an ever-increasing extent. In other words, I think this ecological and political critique of a narrow transference, countertransference-based work is actually going on. Fifthly, and this is the more complicated one of the five, ethical and epistemological critiques of transference, countertransference, and a book could be written about this. Would it be a psychology book, a politics book, or an ethics book, or all three? Don't know. Without intending it, proponents of the centrality of the transference-countertransference relationship are buying into, are joining in with a particular view of human relationships. In this view, people are regarded as atomized, isolated beings that have to struggle into relationship. And when they achieve relationship with a therapist, the two people in this relationship sort of own it. But this is not the only narrative. What about those narratives in which people are always already in connection and relationship? No need to struggle. They do not meet each other via the hurling of projections across empty space, projection from the Latin proiecere, which means to throw a spear at an enemy, which is not exactly a friendly etymological basis for the notion of projection. For there isn't any empty space between people, though it looks that way. I'd like to develop this particular critique a bit. What if we conceive of a rhizome, or rhizome, or nutrient tube buried out of sight, which throws up separate stalks that are nevertheless already connected? I first wrote about this in the paper on countertransference and the mundus imaginalis in 1987, and discovered recently that Jung also uses the image of a rhizome, slightly differently, but in the context of relationality. So people are already connected. Or what if we understand the two people in the therapy room as linked by their citizenship, their membership of the polis, the society, no matter how different that experience might be for them? Or a third option, what if we vision the members of the therapy pair as linked via manifold bodily, physical phenomena, not only mirror neurons, but mirror neurons for sure? Just the fact that two people are in the same society, or two people are breathing in the same space, puts them into a connection that no spear-throwing projections can add to. Here comes the political bit. One need hardly add that the autonomous, separate, individuated person is exactly the person that capitalism and free market theorizing assumes to exist. This is the neoliberal subject, self-governing, enterprising, calculating, separate. So the notion of transference and countertransference and the notion of projections which comes along with it, these are not politically neutral notions, and hence they're not problem-free. But nor too are more relational approaches to the work without their serious problems, to which I now turn my equally jaded and, I have to say, anxious attention. It's time now to pay critical attention to relational analysis and therapy. I'm asking, is this still cutting edge, or is it by now a cliche? There's a phrase, it's the relationship, stupid. Those of you who follow politics will know that this was Bill Clinton's famous electoral maxim in huge letters on the wall of his campaign headquarters. It's the economy, stupid. Meaning that was what decided elections. And so when people in Britain were sitting down to discuss an advertising and public relations campaign in support of psychotherapy and counseling, we came up with the phrase, it's the relationship, stupid. Meaning it's obviously That's what we offer. This was believed by its advocates to be an accurate slogan because it was the therapy relationship that was considered the unique selling point of analysis, psychotherapy, and counseling. The therapy relationship is what the clients want and is what the therapists want to offer them. Hence, relationality or the relational or the therapy relationship have become markers of difference between real psychotherapy and most cognitive behavioral therapies which have swept the world. Anyway, I've been asking whether this idea about the relational or the therapy relationship or relationality in therapy was still cutting edge or had become cliched and conformist. In the paper I wrote about it, I said it was both cutting edge and cliche. And the book that William was plugging actually goes into the cliche side and the cutting edge side of relational work. I argue that the stress on relationship with associated notions of safety, containment, holding, and diminution of risk tend in the conformist direction. Without going so far as to say that making therapy safe is all done in the interests of a therapist, it clearly isn't, I think we have to consider what the professional expectation of many of us, that safety is what clients need, what has it done to the way we work? Does it not reinforce the idea of the client as needy, dependent, infantile, caught between flight and fight? Such clients exist, and maybe every client is like this at some time or another. But to make this the default position is to wire inequality into everything that we do. And that's the second mention on the red thread of inequality. I want to fine this down a bit now and focus on the client as the healer. What we are beginning to see in the literature, and this is my critique of relational psychotherapy, what we are beginning to see in the literature, and hence I think we can assume is being witnessed in practice, is a wholly different conception of the client, a perspective that sees the client as the motor of the therapy. This client is a heroic client in a good sense, a client who knows what she needs, a client who can manage her own distress, a client who engages less in a process of cure or even of healing and more in a process of ongoing inquiry. This multifaceted new client is potentially a healer of others, especially the therapist and in a sense of the world, client as healer. Summarizing a mass of research findings, John Norcross has forced us to consider whether it is truly the therapy relationship that is the main effective element in therapy, as relational practitioners claim. Is the private and highly personal therapy relationship the main thing that makes therapy work? Not really. According to Norcross's meta-analysis, he's a pretty serious researcher of psychotherapy, but he did a meta-analysis of everybody's work. Unexplained and extra-therapeutic factors amount to 40% of efficacy. Now, you don't have to believe in the figures at all. Just reflect on them, if you like, as heuristic metaphors. 40% of what moves a therapy on is unknown. We should be humble at this finding. Extra therapeutic, we don't know what it might be. The therapy relationship, according to the meta-analysis, is responsible for 12%, the actual therapist 8%, and the school or tradition or modality of a therapist 7%. But the thing that amazed me when I started to look at this is that the client accounts for 30% of efficacy, which is a lot. Now, I don't believe in the figures either. And I think John Norcross would be the first to admit that therapy involves all of these things. And I think, as I say, that the findings don't do more than suggest that we consider our ideas about clients as clients. 30%. It's a pretty big project to consider clients as clients. If we take these figures as useful, interesting, and heuristic, as stimulating critical thinking about our clients, we ask, who are our clients? What do they want? And what point in their life journey have they reached? What stage have they reached in what Norcross calls their trajectory of change, It matters where the client is, much more than our literature suggests. We all know that there are clients from whom one learns great lessons. My first training case, as we said in those days, my first training case had a dream early on in the analysis. She dreamt, I visit a doctor who is ill in bed. He begs me to stay. I visit a doctor who is ill in bed. He begs me to stay. Her associations to bed were of illness, of course, and not only of sexuality, although that came into it too. How else might we understand this dream, thinking of clients as healers? Was the doctor, in fact, me? So this could be a wounded healer dream. Or was it a here and now transference? Because sometimes they're right. Was it a here and now transference involving denial that she is not well? Or is she in the grip of an inflation of herself as the anima or mother who brings life and succor to the doctor who is ill in bed? Or was this dream perhaps an accurate perception? I did need something psychological from her, not just that she stick with me so I could get through the training. Crucially, I would say now that there was a further accurate perception in the dream that she could, in fact, help and heal this doctor. The work took place in 1974. Fred Plaut was the supervisor, and at that time, it would have been difficult to think of the client as a healer. I wonder how much has changed. Thinking of the client as a healer, we see that recent thinking about the client has moved in that general direction. From the person-centered approach, we find Bohart and Tallman referring to the active client, and the other Carl Rogers, in the era when the discourse was all of client-centered therapy, makes it clear that the client knows for herself what is needed, where she wants to go. Jung, as ever a clinical pioneer, writes of entropy in the client, an innate process of self-regulation, and Adolf Guggenbuhl-Craig was also a pioneer in this area. From relational psychoanalysis, we read that from Erwin Hoffman that he regards the client as having responsibilities to the analyst and the analysis more than just for the co-creation of the therapy relationship. Let's see what happens if we revision the therapy relationship with all of these thoughts about the client in mind. I'm putting it like this because it's gradually dawned on me, maybe many of you got there before me, that clients sometimes do not dare, for social, cultural, and political reasons, they don't dare to deploy their tacit knowledge and emotional literacy. We therapists are content with clients holding themselves back because it leaves us with a job to do. But that could, and from a critical perspective, maybe should change. These observations on the politics of therapy relationships lead me to try to highlight one aspect of client as healer. This is about a new activist client. The person-centered people talk about active client, and I'm talking about an activist client. I offer this in a tentative spirit, looking for discussion and dialogue about it. Would people agree that one possible goal of therapy might be that during the work, some clients develop their capacity for alterity, including, amongst other things, an empathic and healing concern for the other? Yes, this would certainly mean active concern for other people, but I think there is a more than personal version of this to consider. To the idea that a client is a healer, we could then add that activist clients have the potential to be citizen therapists for the wider world with its environmental problems, economic injustice, and ubiquitous violence. The activist therapy client, revisioned as a healer, may now be understood to be a socially responsible agent of tikkun olam, the Hebrew term for the drive to repair and restore the world. To catch you up, thus far in this talk, which has 3 sections, I've done 2.
Andrew,
Yeah?
you've only got 5 minutes.
Have I?
In the spirit of pluralism, we do want some space to come back to you.
Okay. I've done personal confessions, and I've critiqued transference, countertransference, and relational approaches to therapy and analysis. I now want to talk about analytical psychology and politics, and the politics of analytical psychology. I think it's about 7.5 minutes. These remarks about the activist client lead us into the third and final section of the talk on some political considerations facing analytical psychology, with a particular focus on questions of diversity and equality. As we all know, Jungian analysts, Jungian psychotherapists, and their organizations have got involved in political, humanitarian, and environmental crises and situations in ways which you could not have imagined 25 years or possibly even 15 years ago. I think we are in the middle of developing and making happen Jung's radical intuition, first floated in the 1930s, of the need to create a culturally sensitive psychology. A culturally sensitive psychology does not level out all differences in the psyche that stem from ethnicity, religion, nation, social class, gender, and sexual orientation. Jung was against the universal imposition of a single system. Inevitably, so-called universal psychologies like Freud are context-limited, unhelpfully highly personal confessions. So Jung was perhaps the first to anticipate the ethical and political disaster of a one-size-fits-all colonial global psychology. James Hillman famously claimed that we've had 100 years of psychotherapy and the world is getting worse. But as I've shown, this claim was ahistorical and ill-informed. Hence, there's no need to give up on clinical work. In scholarly manner, Nick Totten clearly documented that a historically accurate title might be, "We've had much more than 100 years of all the schools of psychotherapy trying to change the world, but the world has stayed pretty much the same." I'll skip the stuff on Africans and come to concluding reflections. Fred Plaut felt himself to be in a minority all his life. He was in a minority in the Jewish community in Dusseldorf in spotting the Nazi danger very early. So he went to South Africa, and then he was then in the white minority there, and a German amongst the British and Afrikaners as well. In London, after the war, he remained an immigrant, and he was never in the majority grouping in the SAP. When he went back to Berlin in 1985, he was clearly in a minority again, as an immigrant and as a Jew. But there's a lot to be said for being in the minority in our profession. And I'd like to end by generalizing a little wildly, perhaps, from Fred's experience. These are just a few brief reflections on what it means to be a Jungian analyst in today's world. One page. I suggest that the Jungian analyst who stalks contemporary culture and who is trying to engage with its politics has always been marginal and decentered, not at all integrated, but rather an actor performing many roles in many scripts, characterized by lack, somewhat faded as well as jaded, jerky, marginalized, alienated, split, guilty, empty, nomadic, a minority figure. I think there is something we can do with this vision of a marvelously rebellious Jungian analyst, the misfit, the rebel, the troublemaker, the round peg in a square hole. To embrace this vision of ourselves, we have to firmly reject Jung's aristocratic, elitist, and supercilious ideas. Here's a by no means unusual quote from 1921. "It is obvious that a social group consisting of stunted individuals cannot be a viable and healthy institution." Stunted individuals. Or try this one from 1916. "Whoever is not creative enough to individuate must establish collective conformity with the group of his own choice, otherwise he remains an empty waster and a windbag." So as Jung sees it, we have stunted individuals here, wasters there, windbags there, and truly individuated people in the first-class cabin. No wonder Sonu Shamdasani summarizes Jung as saying individuation is for the few. But there are a lot of people in the world, not just the chosen few, not just the Jungian 1%, or more accurately, the Jungian 0.1%. Don't Jungian analysts, along with others in the liberal professions, have to question whether we really want to live in gated communities and posh neighborhoods, sending our children to elite schools and colleges, staying in fine hotels, employing servants, and in general, feeling ourselves to be better than average human beings? Better, say I, to be stunted, remembering that in our chemical process, the lapis can't be reached without the assembly of perfectly ordinary base elements found everywhere and every day. Or as George Orwell wrote in 1984, if there is hope, it lies in the proles. If there is hope, it lies in the proletariat. Or in the words of Leonardo Boff, whom we accepted by acclamation as an honorary member of the International Association for Analytical Psychology last August in Copenhagen, God is in the poor who cry out, and God is the one who listens to the cry and liberates, so that the poor no longer need to cry out. Thank you.